In the northern Pacific, far from the major fronts of the Second World War, the Aleutian Islands formed a long arc between Alaska and the Soviet Far East. Before 1941, they were a marginal military concern for both Washington and Tokyo. The islands were thinly populated, with small U.S. Army garrisons, a limited U.S. Navy presence, and scattered villages of Unangan, Aleut, inhabitants whose main connections were to regional trade and fishing rather than global strategy. Yet the chain lay astride potential air and sea routes between North America and Asia, and staff officers in both navies occasionally noted its value as a barrier or springboard. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and the rapid expansion of Japanese control in the Western and Central Pacific, U.S. planners re-evaluated the Northern Theater. The United States sought to protect the approaches to the continental West Coast, the ports and bases of Alaska, and the emerging air routes linking North America to Siberia. Japan, for its part, looked for ways to extend its defensive perimeter, complicate U.S. planning, and protect the northern flank of its home islands and the northern approaches to its Central Pacific bases. Intelligence estimates on both sides were incomplete. U.S. authorities had limited information on Japanese intentions toward the North Pacific, relying on intercepted communications, aerial reconnaissance, and sparse civilian shipping reports. Japanese naval staff followed U.S.-based construction in Alaska, but often underestimated the speed with which airfields and harbor facilities could be expanded under wartime pressure. Both navies modeled scenarios in which the opponent might use the Aleutians for bomber bases against Tokyo or the American mainland, even though, in 1942, neither side possessed adequate numbers of long-range aircraft in the region. Public sentiment in the United States focused on more visible crises in the Philippines, the Southwest Pacific, and the Atlantic. The Aleutians appeared in news reports mainly as a reminder of the vast geography now implicated in global war. In Japan, official communications emphasized victories in the South and Central Pacific. The Northern Theater received comparatively little attention, framed as part of broader efforts to secure the maritime perimeter of the empire rather than as a separate campaign. By early 1942, the U.S. Army and Navy increased their presence in Alaska. The Alaska Defense Command grew from a few thousand personnel to tens of thousands, with new airfields on islands such as Adak and Amchitka planned or underway, and additional patrol aircraft, destroyers, and submarines assigned to the area. Conditions were difficult. Frequent fog, strong winds, and low cloud ceilings complicated flying and navigation, while limited port infrastructure restricted the size and tempo of convoys. Japanese naval planners, meanwhile, prepared a complex mid-1942 operation directed at Midway Atoll. As part of this plan, a subsidiary move into the Aleutians was designed to divert U.S. forces northward and to establish outposts on selected islands. The combined fleet aimed to combine tactical gains with psychological effects, demonstrating that Japanese forces could operate near Alaska and thereby introduce uncertainty into U.S. defensive calculations. Within this broader context, Attu was one small island among many in the chain. Before the war, it had a tiny population, including a U.S. weather detachment and Unangan residents engaged in subsistence activities. Its harbors and terrain had not been developed for large-scale military use. Yet its position near the western end of the Aleutians made it part of any attempt to control the passage between the North Pacific and the Bering Sea. When Japanese forces later landed there, they would transform a remote settlement into a focal point of strategic debates in both capitals. Thus, on the eve of Japanese moves into the Aleutians in mid-1942, the preconditions for Operation Sandcrab were already forming. A theater previously considered peripheral had gained new importance in the calculations of two maritime powers, both constrained by weather, distance, and limited intelligence, and both aware that even remote islands could acquire disproportionate strategic weight in a global conflict. In June 1942, the war reached Attu directly. Following carrier-based raids on Dutch Harbor, Japanese forces landed on Kiska on June 6th and on Attu on June 7th. The initial Attu landing force consisted of roughly 1,100 troops from the 301st Independent Infantry Battalion with supporting units, landed without opposition on a fog-covered shoreline. The small U.S. weather detachment and the handful of Unangan residents on the island were unable to resist. The U.S. personnel were killed or captured. The Unangan civilians were deported later to camps in Japan, where many died from disease and malnutrition. For Tokyo, the occupation created a northern outpost on American territory. For Washington, it marked a visible intrusion onto U.S. soil. Command structures reflected the larger priorities of each side. On the Japanese side, the Northern Area Fleet under Vice Admiral Bushiro Hosogaya supervised operations in the Aleutians, with Army garrisons subordinated to regional commands based in the Kuril Islands and Hokkaido. The Attu garrison remained relatively modest in 1942, while Kiska received more than 5,000 troops, coastal guns, and construction units. Japanese engineers began work on airstrip sites and defensive positions, but the climate, limited shipping, and competing demands in other theaters constrained the pace of development. The United States placed responsibility for the region under the Alaska Defense Command and the U.S. Navy's North Pacific Force, Lieutenant General Simon Buckner, Jr. commanded Army ground and air forces in Alaska, while Rear Admiral Robert Theobald and later Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid directed naval operations. Their units included 11th Air Force bomber and fighter squadrons, infantry regiments, engineers, and a small fleet of cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and auxiliaries. Throughout late 1942, these commands adjusted to a theater in which weather and distance imposed heavy limits on surveillance and offensive operations. The opening months after the occupation were characterized by intermittent engagements rather than continuous battle. U.S. aircraft from bases at Umnak and Adak flew long-range missions against Kiska and, less frequently, Attu. Bombers such as B-24s and B-17 attacked harbor facilities and shipping, while P-38s and P-40 provided escort when conditions allowed. Japanese anti-aircraft guns and fighters from distant bases attempted to contest these raids, but fog and low cloud often prevented effective interception. Both sides lost aircraft not only to combat, but to navigation errors and crashes in mountainous terrain. At sea, surface forces clashed in the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands in March 1943, when a U.S. cruiser-destroyer group intercepted a Japanese convoy bound for Attu and Kiska. The engagement ended without ships sunk on either side, but convinced Japanese commanders that surface resupply was increasingly risky. Afterward, they relied more on submarines to carry supplies, ammunition, and small numbers of personnel to the Aleutian garrisons. This shift reduced the volume of material reaching Attu and Kiska, and left the garrisons dependent on limited stocks and what they could construct locally. For the Unangan population of the Aleutians, the opening phase of the campaign meant displacement and loss. U.S. authorities evacuated residents from a number of islands judged vulnerable to further attack, moving them to camps in southern Alaska, where housing and medical support were often inadequate. Those from Attu had already been removed by Japanese forces. Families were separated by national decisions taken far from the islands themselves. Their experience illustrates how indigenous communities became subject to the security priorities of both governments. By early 1943, U.S. commanders judged that the balance of forces in the North Pacific had shifted. Additional Army units, including the 7th Infantry Division, were earmarked for operations in Alaska after training in California and the lower 48 states. Naval reinforcements increased the number of escorts and support ships available to cover amphibious movements. On April 1, 1943, Kincaid received authorization for an operation to retake Attu, designated in planning documents as Operation Sandcrab. The directive marked the transition from a primarily defensive and harassing posture to preparations for a full-scale amphibious assault intended to remove the Japanese foothold at the western end of the Aleutian chain. Planning for Operation Sandcrab took shape in early 1943 as U.S. commanders weighed the risks of an amphibious assault in one of the most inhospitable theaters of the war. The primary American objectives were to remove Japanese forces from Attu, secure the western Aleutians as a shield for Alaska and the continental coast, and gain experience in joint land-sea-air operations under subarctic conditions. A successful landing would also simplify any subsequent move against Kiska and demonstrate that U.S. forces could reverse the occupation of American territory. The main ground component selected for the assault was the 7th Infantry Division, which had initially trained for desert operations, but was reassigned to the North Pacific. Its strength for the Attu operation would be roughly 11,000 to 12,000 combat troops, supported by engineers, artillery, medical units, and specialized detachments. Additional units, including elements of the 4th Infantry Regiment from the Alaska Defense Command and Canadian artillery and support elements, were attached to provide local experience and extra firepower. The landing force as a whole, including service and support personnel, would total more than 15,000 personnel. U.S. planners divided the landing force into northern and southern groups. The southern group was to land in Massacre Bay, establish a beachhead, and push inland toward a central ridgeline. The northern group would land near Holtz Bay, advance toward the same high ground, and then converge on the Japanese positions around Chichagof Harbor. This envelopment concept assumed that once ashore, U.S. infantry could overcome the defenders in a relatively short period with strong naval gunfire and air support to suppress resistance. Naval forces under Rear Admiral Francis Rockwell assembled a task force of transports, destroyers, cruisers, and older battleships such as Nevada, Idaho, and Pennsylvania to provide gunfire support and to protect the convoy against possible intervention by Japanese surface units or submarines. Logistical planning had to account for long distances from major West Coast ports, limited intermediate bases in Alaska, and the need to deliver fuel, ammunition, food, construction materials, and winter clothing for a sizable force into a theater with virtually no existing infrastructure on the target island. Air support was assigned to 11th Air Force, operating from fields on Adak and Amchitka. Its bombers and fighters were tasked with softening Japanese positions on Attu, attacking shipping, and providing reconnaissance during the approach and landing. However, the weather patterns that plagued earlier operations remained a significant factor. Planners acknowledged that fog and low ceilings could prevent close air support on critical days, but there was no alternative theater air force to call upon. On the Japanese side, strategic goals for Attu were narrower but interconnected with broader defense planning. After the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands and increasing U.S. pressure, Japanese leaders debated the value of holding the western Aleutians. Some argued for withdrawal to reduce exposed outposts. Others insisted on maintaining positions that could complicate U.S. operations and serve as early warning points. The decision was made to reinforce Attu and Kiska, with Attu receiving a garrison of around 2,300 to 2,600 Army troops commanded by Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, supported by engineers and service units. Japanese defensive planning relied heavily on the terrain. With limited resources to construct heavy fortifications, units focused on establishing positions on ridges and high ground overlooking likely landing beaches. The intention was to allow U.S. forces to come ashore and then wear them down in protracted fighting in snow-covered valleys and steep slopes, where Japanese infantry, accustomed to operating in dispersed positions, could exploit concealment and prepared firing points. Given the difficulties of resupply and the experience at Komandorsky, the garrison did not assume that major reinforcements or evacuation would be possible once a large-scale U.S. assault began. Intelligence assessments on both sides contain miscalculations. U.S. estimates often placed the Attu garrison at 1,000 or fewer troops and underestimated the extent of defensive preparations. Maps were based on limited pre-war surveys and aerial photography hampered by cloud cover, leading planners to misjudge gradients and the practicability of certain routes inland. Japanese commanders, for their part, underestimated the size of the amphibious force that the United States could assemble in the North Pacific by mid-1943 and overestimated the deterrent effect of distance and weather on U.S. decision-making. Information policy and public messaging accompanied these military preparations. In the United States, the forthcoming operation was framed within official circles as a necessary step to remove an enemy presence from American soil though details remained classified until after the landings. In Japan, the Aleutian garrisons were incorporated into broader narratives about defending the northern approaches of the empire, but the small scale and remoteness of the force limited the resources allocated to them. These differing strategic priorities shaped the planning cycles that would converge on Attu when Operation Sandcrab moved from documents to execution in May 1943. In early May 1943, the task force carrying the assault troops sailed from Cold Bay and other Alaskan staging points toward Attu. The convoy included more than a dozen transports and cargo ships escorted by cruisers, destroyers, and 3 battleships assigned primarily for shore bombardment. The planners aimed to approach under cover of Aleutian weather, using low clouds and fog to conceal movements from any Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. At the same time, those same conditions limited visual navigation and air spotting for naval gunfire. On 11th May, the first U.S. troops went ashore. The northern force landed in the vicinity of Holt's Bay, while the southern force landed at Massacre Bay. There was no large-scale opposition at the waterline. Japanese doctrine in this sector emphasized inland defense rather than direct beach resistance, and many forward Japanese elements had withdrawn to higher ground. However, the landings were hampered by surf, cold water, and poor visibility. Some units were put ashore on beaches different from those originally planned, which complicated the movement of artillery and supplies. Once inland, U.S. infantry encountered terrain that differed markedly from expectations based on maps and planning models. Rather than firm ground, much of Attu's surface consisted of tundra and muskeg, which absorbed the weight of men and equipment, slowing movement and causing fatigue. Slopes that appeared moderate in aerial photographs turned out to be steep and broken by ravines. Snow lay in deep drifts on ridges, while fog drifted in and out, limiting observation to a few hundred meters at many points. Initial contact with Japanese forces occurred as American patrols pushed toward the interior ridges above the landing areas. Japanese soldiers had established foxholes, trenches, and machine gun nests with fields of fire covering likely avenues of approach. In several cases, U.S. units advancing in column along narrow draws came under sudden fire from concealed positions on heights, resulting in casualties and forcing temporary withdrawals. Artillery support from the beachhead was difficult to coordinate because observers could rarely see both friendly troops and enemy positions at the same time. The early days of the fighting revealed practical problems in equipment and clothing. The 7th Infantry Division had been re-equipped with cold weather gear, but boots and rainwear were not always adequate for continuous exposure to wet ground and near-freezing temperatures. Weapons sometimes malfunctioned due to moisture and fine grit. Medical detachments reported cases of trench foot and exposure alongside battle injuries. Evacuating wounded from forward slopes to aid stations near the beaches could require hours of effort by litter teams, struggling over soft ground and through snow. Japanese units used the landscape to limit the effectiveness of U.S. advantages in firepower. Mortar and machine gun teams frequently fired short bursts and then shifted to alternate positions, making counter-battery fire less effective. At night, Japanese patrols probed American lines, seeking to disrupt sleep, inflict casualties, and gather information about unit locations. U.S. troops responded with flares, tripwires, and overlapping fields of small arms fire, but the fog and uneven ground made it difficult to maintain continuous observation. Air support during the first phase of the ground campaign was intermittent. 11th Air Force bombers and fighters flew missions from Adak and Amchitka, but low ceilings and crosswinds often prevented them from locating targets or forced them to return without releasing ordnance. When visibility permitted, aircraft attacked suspected Japanese positions and supply dumps, yet the lack of precise intelligence about the defensive layout meant that some strikes fell on empty ground. Naval gunfire from the battleships and cruisers added a further layer of indirect support, but again, spotting was constrained by weather. By 13 to 14 May, U.S. commanders assessed that progress was slower than anticipated. Instead of advancing rapidly to link the Holt's Bay and Massacre Bay forces and then pushing toward Chichagof Harbor, units had to fight for successive ridgelines, sometimes gaining only a few hundred meters at the cost of dozens of casualties. Communications lines, mostly laid by signal troops across open slopes, were vulnerable to damage from shell fire, traffic, and weather, leading to delays in transmitting orders and requests for support. For the Japanese garrison, these early engagements confirmed expectations that the main battle would occur not at the shoreline, but in the interior. Colonel Yamasaki's troops, numbering roughly 2,300 to 2,600, rotated between frontline positions and rear shelters, conserving ammunition and ration stocks while inflicting losses where terrain favored the defense. Their isolation was recognized, submarine resupply was limited, and there was no realistic prospect of large-scale reinforcement. In this first phase of the ground campaign, both sides confronted the combined effects of a determined opponent and an environment that imposed its own constraints, shaping the pattern of the fighting that followed. As the battle on Attu entered its second week, the engagement expanded in both scale and intensity. U.S. commanders, confronted with slower-than-expected progress, committed additional units to the fight. Infantry battalions initially held in reserve were moved forward to reinforce both the northern sector near Holt's Bay and the southern sector around Massacre Bay. Artillery batteries, including 75mm pack howitzers and 105mm pieces, were laboriously brought inland, sometimes requiring improvised sleds and manpower teams to haul guns over snow-covered slopes. The drive to link the two lodgements became a central focus. In the north, troops fought for control of the ridges overlooking Holt's Bay, where Japanese positions covered narrow approaches with interlocking machine gun and mortar fire. In the south, units advancing from Massacre Valley toward the Central Plateau encountered similar resistance. The attempt to secure passes such as the corridor, later known as Jarman Pass, involved repeated assaults, with attackers exposed on open tundra while defenders fired from prepared sites on higher ground. Gains were often measured in ridgelines taken rather than in kilometers advanced. Casualties rose as fighting concentrated on these key features. In addition to those killed or wounded by direct fire, many soldiers were evacuated for hypothermia, trench foot, and other non-combat conditions. Medical reports from mid-May indicate that non-battle casualties at times equaled or exceeded those from enemy action. The ratio reflected the combined effect of prolonged exposure, heavy physical exertion, and difficulties in maintaining dry clothing and footwear. Evacuation to ships offshore reduced mortality, but placed further strain on logistics and hospital facilities. On the Japanese side, the garrison situation also deteriorated. Ammunition expenditure increased as attacks mounted, and resupply by submarine had already been limited before the landings. Ration stocks declined, and some units reduced their daily food intake. Communication with higher headquarters in the Kuril Islands remained intermittent due to weather and radio conditions. Reports sent by Colonel Yamasaki conveyed that, while defensive positions still held, the attackers were gaining ground, and that the prospect of relief was remote. The garrison prepared for continued fighting under conditions of isolation. Command and control posed challenges for both sides. U.S. headquarters on Attu had to coordinate infantry advances, artillery schedules, naval gunfire, and the occasional availability of air sorties. Fog frequently disrupted prearranged fire plans when units lost visual contact with landmarks or when aircraft could not identify targets. Radio sets functioned, but were subject to interference and damage. Field telephone lines were repeatedly broken by shell fragments, traffic, or slides. As a result, battalion and regimental commanders sometimes had incomplete information about adjacent units or the exact position of the front. In Washington, the War Department followed the situation through coded dispatches, noting the slower-than-planned timetable, but also the steady accumulation of tactical positions. The Aleutian operation had to be balanced against demands for shipping, equipment, and formations in the North African, European, and Southwest Pacific theaters. Senior planners accepted the resource costs of continuing the Attu campaign, on the grounds that allowing a Japanese foothold on U.S. territory to persist would have strategic and political implications disproportionate to the island's size. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters assessed the battle through reports filtered up from the Northern Area commands. the High Command had to decide whether to risk major naval units in an attempt to disrupt the U.S. amphibious force, as at earlier engagements in the Pacific. Given the outcome of previous carrier battles, the allocation of forces to the Solomons and Central Pacific, and the uncertainties imposed by North Pacific weather, Japanese leaders chose not to commit a fleet operation to Attu. This decision effectively confirmed that the garrison would have to rely on its own resources. Morale among U.S. troops reflected a mixture of determination and fatigue. Soldiers and junior officers recorded in letters and diaries that the environment, rather than only the opponent, dominated their daily experience. Constant wetness, limited visibility, and the psychological effect of moving through fog where enemy fire could appear without warning. Japanese soldiers experienced similar strains from cold, hunger, and sleeplessness, but many were guided by orders emphasizing the importance of holding out as long as possible and, if necessary, dying in place rather than surrendering. By the third week of May, both sides were fully committed. The American force on the island had grown to more than 15,000 personnel when support and service elements are included, while the Japanese garrison remained limited to roughly 1/6 of that number. Yet numerical superiority did not translate straightforwardly into rapid success. The terrain, climate, and defensive preparations ensured that the crisis phase of the battle would be decided not simply by numbers, but by the ability of each side to sustain operations in an environment that imposed continuous friction on movement, supply, and command. The peak of the Attu campaign came in the last 10 days of May 1943, when U.S. forces concentrated their efforts on the central high ground that controlled access to Chichagof Harbor. After securing footholds in Holtz Bay and Massacre Bay, the 7th Infantry Division turned to seizing the dominant terrain features that Japanese defenders had integrated into a continuous system of positions. Ridges later identified on U.S. maps as Fish Hook Ridge, Buffalo Ridge, and adjacent heights formed a curve of elevations that shielded the remaining Japanese center. To break this line, U.S. commanders organized coordinated attacks involving multiple regiments. Infantry battalions advanced in staggered formations, with one unit attempting to pin Japanese positions, while another maneuvered along flanks where slopes permitted. Artillery fire, now delivered from guns and placed further inland, preceded many of these assaults. Naval gunfire from battleships offshore supplemented this effort, with heavy shells directed at suspected strongpoints and reverse slopes. Each push, however, was slowed by fog, snowfields, and the need to keep supply routes open across ground that could barely support vehicles. The fighting on these heights reached its highest intensity around 19th to 22nd May. In some sectors, Japanese machine gun teams held positions until U.S. troops closed to within grenade range, then shifted to secondary emplacements prepared in advance. Mortar fire fell on assembly areas and narrow saddles where units had to converge. U.S. companies reported casualty rates that, over several days, reduced some frontline units by 1/3 of their strength. Engineers working under fire cut steps into icy slopes, laid corduroy paths across boggy patches, and widened routes for pack animals and hand-carried ammunition. Medical services operated at full capacity. Aid stations clustered near the beachheads treated both battle wounds and medical cases arising from exposure, infection, and accidents on slippery ground. Evacuation chains extended from forward aid posts to collecting points and then to hospital ships when sea conditions allowed. The concentration of casualties during the ridge battles strained these systems. Surgical teams worked in shifts, and some soldiers remained at forward positions after minor treatment, because removing them would have further reduced the attacking units. Japanese casualties also mounted as the pressure increased. Defending companies that had started the battle at strengths of around 150 men were reduced through steady losses to much smaller groups. Ammunition became scarcer, particularly for mortars and heavy machine guns, forcing platoon leaders to ration fire and prioritize targets. The lack of replacements meant that positions abandoned due to attrition could rarely be reoccupied in strength. Nevertheless, surviving troops continued to use concealed routes between foxholes and cave shelters to maintain resistance on key crests. High command decisions during this phase reflected recognition that the campaign was approaching a decisive outcome. On the U.S. side, Major General Albert Brown, the initial commander of the landing force, was relieved and replaced by Major General Eugene Landrum after concerns about the pace and coordination of operations. The change did not alter the basic plan, but signaled the priority placed by higher headquarters on accelerating the capture of Attu before weather, shipping demands, or Japanese responses created new complications. Orders emphasized renewed attacks to break the remaining ridge positions and drive the defenders back toward the harbor basin. On the Japanese side, Colonel Yamasaki and his staff reviewed the situation as U.S. troops closed in from multiple directions. With supply routes cut and no realistic prospect of reinforcement, they faced a narrowing set of options: maintain a shrinking perimeter in hopes of prolonging resistance, attempt small counterattacks to disrupt U.S. logistics, or prepare for a single large offensive effort while sufficient troops remained. Communications with superior headquarters confirmed that a breakout to external relief forces was not feasible. The focus shifted to determining how to use the remaining manpower and ammunition to maximum tactical effect. Civilians were largely absent from the island during this peak phase. The pre-war Unangan inhabitants of Attu had been removed by Japanese forces the previous year, and U.S. policy had evacuated Unangan populations from other islands to camps in Alaska. As a result, the immediate impact of the ridge battles fell almost entirely on military personnel. However, decisions made in this period would later shape how both governments handled the question of repatriation, resettlement, and memorialization of the destroyed village sites and the communities associated with them. By the time U.S. forces gained control of the main heights overlooking Chichagof Harbor, the tactical balance had shifted decisively. The Japanese garrison still maintained inner positions and shelters, but its defensive system had lost much of its depth and flexibility. For the attackers, the capture of the central ridges provided observation over the remaining Japanese area and shortened supply lines. For the defenders, it marked the point at which the battle could no longer be sustained as a static defense. The conditions were set for a final attempt by the garrison to influence the outcome, leading to the climactic events of the campaign's last days. As the Japanese perimeter contracted toward Chichagof Harbor, both sides adjusted their methods to the conditions on the ground. For U.S. units, early assumptions about rapid movement had been replaced by routines adapted to slow progress, limited visibility, and constant moisture. Companies reorganized their internal layouts, placing automatic weapons and mortars where they could cover multiple avenues of approach across the tundra. Patrols moved in wedges rather than single files to reduce vulnerability to ambush in ravines and draws. Logistics adaptations were crucial. Standard vehicles often bogged down, so supply officers increased reliance on tracked carriers, pack animals, and human porters. Ammunition and rations were cached at intermediate points on slopes, reducing the distance that frontline troops had to travel back to resupply. Engineers improved drainage around trenches and dugouts, using whatever materials were available to create platforms above saturated ground. These measures did not remove the hardships, but they reduced the rate at which equipment deteriorated and personnel became non-combat casualties. Fire support procedures also evolved. Artillery units experimented with pre-planned barrages tied to terrain features rather than to precise grid coordinates that could be difficult to confirm in fog. Forward observers, sometimes operating only a short distance ahead of the infantry, used sound and limited visual cues to adjust fire. When air support was available, pilots and ground controllers refined recognition signals, such as colored panels, to reduce the risk of misidentification in patchy cloud. Naval gunfire missions were increasingly scheduled for specific times and sectors, allowing infantry to anticipate when suppressive fire would be available as they moved. Japanese forces responded with their own forms of resistance and adaptation. As positions on the outer ridges became untenable, units withdrew to secondary lines closer to the harbor, often moving at night or under fog cover. They made increasing use of natural hollows and man-made cave shelters cut into slopes, which offered protection against shell fragments and aerial bombardment. Within these shelters, small groups stored ammunition, food, and medical supplies to sustain independent fighting, even if wider communications broke down. Tactically, Japanese troops relied on sudden local counterattacks to disrupt U.S. advances. Small detachments would infiltrate through folds in the terrain, strike at forward platoons or support elements, and then attempt to withdraw before heavier fire could be brought to bear. In some cases, these actions succeeded in delaying U.S. progress or forcing redeployment of units guarding supply lines. In others, they resulted in significant casualties for the attackers, reflecting the increasing density of U.S. fire and the growing familiarity of American troops with Japanese tactics. Improvisation appeared in medical and support arrangements on both sides. U.S. medics adapted techniques to cope with wounds complicated by cold and prolonged evacuation times, using additional insulation and improvised sleds for transport. Japanese medical personnel, facing shortages of drugs and dressings, reused materials and prioritized care to those who could still fight. As food stocks dwindled, Japanese soldiers supplemented rations with local plants when possible, though Attu offered limited resources beyond what had been brought in by ship. The psychological dimension of the campaign became more prominent as the battle continued. U.S. soldiers and Marines, many of whom had not previously fought in similar environments, began to interpret the fog and silence between engagements as signals of possible attack, producing a continuous strain that some accounts liken to that of more continuous combat. Commanders responded with rotation policies, pulling units off the line for short periods when space and circumstances allowed, though the limited area of operations constrained these efforts. Japanese morale was shaped by different expectations. Orders and training had prepared troops for the possibility that withdrawal or surrender might not be authorized. The knowledge that submarine resupply was uncertain and that no major relief operation was planned reinforced a sense that the garrison functioned as a self-contained defensive outpost. Some soldiers expressed in diaries and letters a commitment to hold out as long as possible. Others recorded concern about the prospects of survival, particularly as ammunition and food declined. Intelligence gathering and adaptation were intertwined. U.S. interrogations of captured Japanese soldiers and examination of abandoned positions provided information about defensive layouts, weapon types, and ration levels. This data fed into revised estimates of garrison strength and helped refine targeting for artillery and airstrikes. Japanese observers, in turn, noted the patterns of U.S. artillery preparation and the timing of attacks, adjusting their use of cover and movement to reduce exposure during expected bombardments. In the broader command context, the Aleutian campaign served as a testing ground for techniques that might later be applied in other cold or mountainous theaters. Staff officers recorded lessons about clothing, shelter construction, and the need for specialized training before committing units to such environments. For the participants on Attu, however, adaptation was an immediate necessity rather than a theoretical exercise. Each side sought ways to maintain combat effectiveness amid declining strength and accumulating fatigue, knowing that the choices made in this phase would influence how the final stage of the battle unfolded. The turning point of the battle came at the end of May 1943, when the Japanese garrison, compressed into a reduced perimeter near Chichagolf Harbor, chose to abandon static defense in favor of a single concentrated attack. By that stage, U.S. forces controlled the surrounding heights, supply lines to the landing beaches were functioning despite difficulties, and artillery and naval fire could reach most of the remaining Japanese positions. Within the Japanese command post, Colonel Yamasaki and his staff reviewed reports of ammunition shortages, limited food, and the steady loss of outlying positions. The option of prolonged resistance in isolated pockets appeared unsustainable. Japanese doctrine and the specific orders governing many Pacific outposts emphasized continued resistance even in encirclement. In this context, Yamasaki chose to assemble the remaining effective strength of the garrison for a coordinated offensive aimed at breaking through U.S. lines, disrupting rear areas, and inflicting maximum damage before the garrison was destroyed. Estimates based on post-battle counts suggest that between 800 and 1,000 Japanese soldiers were gathered for this effort, drawn from infantry, engineer, and service units still capable of movement and fighting. The plan called for a pre-dawn attack to exploit limited visibility and to achieve surprise against U.S. positions that had been oriented primarily toward gradual advances rather than a sudden massed assault. Japanese units were organized into assault groups equipped with rifles, bayonets, grenades, and light machine guns, while remaining heavy weapons and ammunition stocks were left behind or destroyed. Medical personnel, remaining seriously wounded, and many support staff stayed in shelters, indicating that the operation was not designed as a breakout with follow-on movement, but as a final engagement. U.S. commanders had anticipated local counterattacks, but not a coordinated assault of this scale. Frontline companies had dug in on the slopes below the ridges captured earlier, with machine guns, mortars, and rifle pits covering likely approaches. Communications plans were designed for incremental advances, with artillery fires prearranged to support movement toward Saichagov Harbor, rather than to repel a large force moving outward from it. In rear areas, supply depots, aid stations, and command posts were located with reference to the previous pattern of fighting, not to the possibility of significant enemy penetration. In the early hours of 29th May, under low visibility conditions, the Japanese assault force moved out from its remaining perimeter and advanced silently toward the nearest U.S. positions. Initial contact occurred when forward elements struck American outposts and company lines, in some sectors surprising sentries and pushing through before a full alarm could be raised. Accounts from both sides describe close-range combat, with bayonets, grenades, and small arms used at distances far shorter than those typical of earlier phases on Attu. The assault achieved a substantial local penetration. Japanese troops overran elements of U.S. infantry battalions and reached rear echelons, including aid stations and artillery positions. Some batteries were temporarily unable to fire because crews joined in direct defense of their guns. The disruption extended to signal lines and command channels, complicating efforts to coordinate a response in the first hours of the attack. For a time, segments of the U.S. force on Attu fought in semi-isolated groups, each responding to the assault as it appeared in its immediate sector. As the morning progressed, however, numerical and logistical factors began to assert themselves. Additional U.S. units were brought into the fighting from reserve and support roles, forming ad hoc defensive lines to contain and then push back the assault groups. Artillery, once communication was restored to key observation posts, was redirected to strike areas where Japanese troops had concentrated or were attempting to regroup. The limited ammunition carried by the assaulting units became a constraint as the engagement extended beyond its initial phase. Casualty figures from this day underline its role as the climactic moment of the battle. U.S. losses during the final assault added significantly to total casualties on Attu, which by the end of the campaign amounted to roughly 550 killed, over 1,100 wounded, and more than 1,200 classified as serious non-battle cases from cold and exposure. Japanese losses during the entire campaign were estimated at around 2,350 killed, with only a few dozen taken prisoner, many of them wounded or unconscious at the time of capture. The concentration of fatalities among the attacking force on the 29th of May reflects the intensity and finality of the operation. For individual participants, the turning point was experienced not as an abstract shift in momentum, but as a period of compressed and confused combat in which established front lines dissolved. U.S. medics treated wounded from both sides in rapidly changing conditions, sometimes under fire. Japanese soldiers who survived the initial hours of the assault faced the choice of attempting to continue fighting in small groups, withdrawing toward now shattered inner positions, or, in rare cases, surrendering when further resistance was impossible. By the end of the day, organized Japanese resistance as a cohesive garrison had effectively ceased. Isolated individuals and small groups remained in caves and depressions, but the offensive effort that had been intended to alter the course of the battle had expended the last concentrated manpower of the garrison. For U.S. forces, repelling the assault simultaneously removed the primary remaining threat to their positions and confirmed that the campaign had passed from the phase of maneuver and major engagements into one of localized searches and isolated confrontations, marking a clear turning point in the struggle for Attu. In the days following the final Japanese assault, organized combat on Attu gave way to clearance operations, recovery of dead and wounded, and consolidation of positions. U.S. units were tasked with sweeping remaining valleys, ridges, and ravines for isolated Japanese soldiers who had survived the attack or remained in shelters. These patrols combined caution with the need to complete the mission before deteriorating weather and terrain made prolonged occupation more difficult. Encounters ranged from brief exchanges of fire to instances where small groups of Japanese troops chose suicide over surrender, reflecting the training and expectations that had shaped their conduct throughout the campaign. Engineers began transforming the battlefield into a functioning base. They improved landing facilities in Massacre Bay and Chichagof Harbor, marked and cleared minefields, and constructed more permanent roads and tracks across the island. Work parties recovered abandoned Japanese equipment for analysis, including artillery pieces, small arms, and documents. Intelligence officers examined maps, diaries, and operational orders recovered from command posts and individual soldiers, seeking insight into Japanese defensive planning, supply levels, and communication methods. These findings contributed to assessments that would later inform operations against Kiska and other island campaigns in the Pacific. The burial and identification of the dead became a major immediate task. U.S. graves registration units cataloged American remains, marking temporary cemeteries on Attu for later reburial or repatriation. Japanese dead were interred in mass or group graves, often near the locations where they had fallen. At this stage of the war, systematic repatriation of Japanese remains to the home islands was not feasible, and many graves would remain on Attu for decades. The concentration of fatalities from both sides on a small area of ground created a physical reminder of the intensity of the fighting, even as the island shifted from contested territory to a rear base. Medical services transitioned from crisis response to longer-term care. Wounded U.S. personnel were evacuated to hospitals in Alaska and the continental United States for surgery and rehabilitation. Non-battle casualties from frostbite, trench foot, and related conditions entered recovery programs that sometimes lasted months. For the Japanese side, the small number of prisoners taken, including wounded, received treatment under U.S. medical protocols and were later moved to prisoner of war camps where they were interrogated about their units, training, and perceptions of the campaign. Civilian consequences emerged more clearly in the aftermath. The Unangan inhabitants of Attu remained absent, detained in Japan since their removal in 1942. Their village had been destroyed during the occupation and fighting. Elsewhere in the Aleutians, Unangan communities that had been evacuated by U.S. authorities to camps in southeastern Alaska continued to live in crowded conditions with limited access to employment and adequate housing. Decisions about whether and how to return them to their original islands would be influenced by post-campaign assessments of the Aleutians' military value and the cost of rebuilding civilian infrastructure in areas now dominated by bases and airfields. Strategically, the capture of Attu removed the westernmost Japanese position on U.S. territory and altered the balance in the North Pacific. For U.S. planners, the island now offered potential airfield sites that could support patrols, bombardment missions, and coverage of sea lanes between the Aleutians and the Coral Chain. Construction began on runway extensions and support facilities, turning sections of the former battlefield into an operational air base. The presence of these installations made it more difficult for Japanese forces to maintain their remaining position on Kiska and increased the pressure on Tokyo to reconsider the viability of holding isolated outposts in the Aleutians. The immediate next step in the theater was planning for the reduction of Kiska. Intelligence had to determine the strength of the garrison, the feasibility of bombardment versus assault, and the risks of mines, submarines, and air attack. Lessons from Attu shaped these deliberations. The importance of accurate estimates of enemy strength, the need for specialized equipment for cold and wet environments, and the value of close coordination between ground, naval, and air elements. Units that had fought on Attu were debriefed on tactics, equipment performance, and logistical arrangements, producing reports circulated through higher headquarters. For Japan, the loss of Attu forced a reassessment of its northern defensive perimeter, The garrison had not been relieved, and the decision not to commit a fleet to contest the landing underscored constraints on Japanese naval flexibility after earlier battles in the Central Pacific. The fate of the Attu force became a case study within Japanese staff circles of the limits of isolated island defenses when confronted by a foe able to mobilize superior shipping, artillery, and air power, even under harsh climatic conditions. It also influenced the decision, later in 1943, to evacuate Kiska rather than fight a similar battle there. In the weeks after the island was declared secure, U.S. public information gradually released details of the operation. Official communiques highlighted the fact that U.S. forces had retaken territory previously occupied by Japanese troops, while casualty figures and descriptions of weather conditions gave the public a sense of the difficulties involved. For many Americans, Attu and the Aleutians remained less prominent than other theaters, but within military circles, the campaign was recognized as a significant test of amphibious and cold weather operations. By early summer 1943, active combat on Attu had ended, but the island had been reshaped from a remote outpost with a small indigenous population into a fortified base embedded in the logistics of a global war. The immediate aftermath combined military consolidation, medical and burial work, and the first steps toward broader strategic and civilian decisions that would extend far beyond the limited land area on which the battle had taken place. In the longer view of the Second World War, Operation Sandcrab and the battle for Attu formed a relatively small campaign in terms of numbers engaged, yet they had distinct military, political, and social consequences. Militarily, the operation demonstrated that the United States could project a combined arms amphibious force into remote, climatically hostile regions and sustain it long enough to overcome a prepared garrison. For planners, the experience contributed to doctrines for later assaults on fortified islands, even though the conditions in the Central and Western Pacific differed in climate and scale. Within the North Pacific theater, the recapture of Attu and the subsequent evacuation of Kiska by Japanese forces in July 1943 removed the only enemy occupations of territory under U.S. sovereignty. This closure of the Aleutian front freed ships, aircraft, and ground units for redeployment to more critical areas, while retaining bases that could monitor sea and air routes toward the Kuril Islands and the northern approaches to Japan. Airfields established on Attu and neighboring islands supported patrols and occasional strikes against the Kurils, though these never developed into a major independent front. For the U.S. military, Attu became a case study in logistics and environmental adaptation. Reports emphasized the importance of specialized clothing, shelter construction, and training for operations in cold, wet climates. The high proportion of non-battle casualties led to changes in boot design, ration planning, and medical protocols. In staff colleges and post-war analyses, the campaign was often cited alongside other difficult theaters as an example of how terrain and weather could impose costs comparable to those inflicted by an active enemy. Japanese military institutions drew different lessons. The fate of the Attu garrison highlighted the limitations of isolated outposts once enemy naval superiority and air cover were established. Internal evaluations noted that while the defenders had made effective use of terrain, lack of reinforcement options and restricted resupply made sustained resistance impossible beyond a certain point. These conclusions influenced later decisions to withdraw from similarly exposed positions when feasible, and to concentrate defenses closer to the home islands and major logistical hubs. The civilian and indigenous dimensions of the campaign left a more complex legacy. For the Unagan people of Attu, the wartime deportation to Japan, the deaths in detention, and the destruction of their village meant that the community as it had existed before 1942 was not reconstituted after the war. U.S. policy decisions in the late 1940s did not restore permanent Unangan settlement on Attu, and the island remained primarily a military and later wildlife area. Unangan communities from other Aleutian islands, evacuated by U.S. authorities to camps in Alaska during the war, faced prolonged displacement and often inadequate compensation, issues later acknowledged in official inquiries and legislation. In both the United States and Japan, the memory of Attu evolved unevenly. In U.S. narratives, the battle was sometimes described as a forgotten or lesser-known front, overshadowed by campaigns in Europe, the Central Pacific, and the Philippines. Veterans and historians, however, kept attention on the high casualty rates relative to the number of troops engaged and on the specific hardships of the Aleutian environment. In Japan, public awareness of the Aleutian operations remained limited compared to larger battles in the Pacific and Asia, though surviving records and veterans' testimonies preserved the story of the garrison's experience. Over time, the island itself became a site of commemoration. Memorials were established to American and Japanese dead, and occasional joint ceremonies reflected an effort to recognize losses on both sides without revisiting the political disputes of the war years. Researchers and military historians visited the former battlefields to document remaining trenches, shell craters, and equipment fragments, adding empirical detail to archival sources and personal accounts. In strategic retrospect, Operation Sandcrab did not decide the outcome of the Pacific War, which turned on larger carrier battles, submarine campaigns, and operations in the Central and Western Pacific. Its significance lay instead in specific domains: the removal of an enemy foothold on U.S. soil, the refinement of cold weather, amphibious and joint operations, the illustration of the limits of isolated garrisons, and the long-term impact on indigenous communities whose lands became contested ground between states. The legacy of Attu thus spans military, political, and social dimensions. It links a remote island campaign to broader questions about how states wage war in marginal regions, how they treat local populations under security pressures, and how societies remember battles that were vital to participants yet peripheral in grand strategic terms. Through official records, veterans' recollections, and the material traces on the landscape, Operation Sandcrab remains a documented example of how global conflict can reshape even the most distant and sparsely populated places.